who is Jude and who is he talking to and why is he writing them a letter? That's what we're going to talk about today. You know, Jude is a really short book, and you can read the whole thing in about 3 minutes. It actually takes longer to describe the information behind the scenes about Jude than it does to read the entire chapter. But we are going to talk about it before we get started with it in the Bible in Small Steps. It's 25 verses, one chapter. There's no divisions in it at all. And it wouldn't even need it if it had any. And yet we talk about the idea of who wrote it and whether we can trust that it is the person we think that wrote it. This has occupied serious scholars for 2,000 years. And before we go through that verse, I kind of want to give you that full picture about who this is. So in this particular case, tradition of who people think it is, the early church fathers who thought they knew who it was, and who he says he is himself. That's what we're going to talk about. It starts out, first of all, by let's saying that Jude is not actually his name. The English translators named him Jude when his name was actually Judas. But they didn't want, I think, him getting confused with that other guy, Judas. Nobody wants to be known as the betrayer of Jesus. But Judas or Iotus was a fairly common name back in this time. So the English translators decided to render it as Jude to make it distinguished from that other guy. The opening part of the letter in verse says that this is Jude or Judas, a servant of Jesus Christ, and the brother of James. There's no other claim to identification in there, but we know James, and everybody would have known who James was. In the early church, there was only one James that was mentioned or talked about. James, who was the apostle, who was the son of Zebedee, was killed by Herod Agrippa and was long dead before this letter was ever written. So James would have been recognized as the James who was the head of church in Jerusalem, who presided over the Council of Jerusalem in Acts 15. It's the same James that Paul calls a pillar of the church in the book of Galatians, and it's everyone knew it. Everybody knew it. Now, this is kind of an interesting debating point because Protestants believe that Jesus had brothers and sisters, and Catholics believe that Mary remained a virgin her entire life. And so in that particular case, these brothers of Jesus were actually more like cousins or, hey, we're all spiritual brothers together. I even heard someone say that maybe Joseph had been married before Mary and these were his children. But anyway, the idea is that there's a debate there. We're not going to get into a big theological debate about it, but it's an interesting fact. So when Jude says that he is the brother of James, he's also the brother, in Protestant view, of Jesus as well. But he doesn't identify himself as that. He doesn't call that in to to give himself credibility. And so he could have led, hey, I'm the brother of the Lord, and no one would have argued with him on that. But he didn't do it. And there's reasons that people think it was over humility that essentially they were all skeptics. James, the whole family, were skeptics of Jesus until after the resurrection. And so now he's just calling himself a servant of Jesus. So it's an important point. And we will recall that in the Gospels, it talks about how Mary and the brothers and sisters of Jesus came to Jesus after he was preaching in a synagogue and wanted to haul him back home because he was saying crazy things and they wanted him to go home before something bad happened. So his family were skeptics until after the resurrection. Jude himself doesn't talk about that at all. But John 7:5 says it that basically nobody, not even his brothers, believed in Jesus. They were all skeptics. And then something happened. You know, you get it. These are going to be people who saw Jesus learn his letters, work in Joseph's shop, go through ordinary Galilean childhood, and now he's claiming to be the Messiah. And in Mark 3, it points out, like I said, that the family showed up and said, hey, come home. You got to get you out of here. Paul gives us a clue in 1 Corinthians 15 that in the summary of the resurrection appearances, that Christ appeared to Peter, and then the 12, and then 500 at once. James specifically was one of those that was appeared to. We don't know if Jude was one of them or if James went and told Jude, but by some mechanism, James or Jude became a Christian. Their viewpoints shifted from skeptics to believers. And then they were there alongside of the apostles and the other disciples waiting in the upper room for Pentecost. So something happened to the point where Jude became the guy to write a letter carrying real authority in the tone. He's not declaring a title for himself. He's doing this as a servant of Christ. So it's really interesting. And when we look at this particular piece, think about it like as part of authority. Is he could have claimed to be, if this was a forgery, this was somebody else. Why pick an obscure brother of James? You would have picked Peter. You would have picked John. You would have picked James at least. You wouldn't have picked Judas to fake a name, right? So just the obscurity of this being a letter of Jude gives it a little bit of credibility right there. So the other part of it is that he signed it as the brother of James. And if it was a forgery, he would have tried to increase his importance. And he didn't do that. Servant of Christ. So he didn't even give himself that title. And the other part of it, too, is that when you look at the Greek closely enough, it's capable. It has a Semitic dialect to his writing that someone who was in that particular period, who thought in Aramaic, wrote in Greek, a bilingual Jew who was competent enough to write in Greek. It's not polished like a native Greek-speaking rhetoric, at the Parthenon or anything like that, something like what you would see in Hebrews. It was someone with a working class, second language skills that was in this particular area at this particular time. So it's broadly accepted as Jude. There's something that was called the Muratorian Canon, and it's one of the earliest surviving lists of the New Testament books. It dates to about 170 AD. And if you feel like that sounds late, that is about 80 years after the death of John. So not terribly late. And, we think about things we knew 80 years ago, right? It's vastly different than what we know from 500 years ago. So essentially, people who were alive at the time that this canon list came out knew John, put it as part of the canon. Even Clement of Alexandria, Tertullian, Origen, all major theological voices in the 2nd and 3rd century AD treated this as genuine scripture. And Origen went as far to say that this was full of mighty words of heavenly wisdom. And that's not language that church fathers would have used to a document that was suspected to be a forgery. So that they felt this was the actual real deal. The biggest, I think, debate against it, I thought that had value, is that Jude quotes a non-canonical book of 1st Enoch. And it's not part of the New Testament, but yet he quotes it. So they would say, well, wouldn't someone who grew up with Jesus hold it more tightly together, not include a book that's not part of canon? So there's a lot of books that are mentioned in the Bible that are lost. We don't even know what those books are. First, the Chronicles of Israel and the Chronicles of Judah. There's a story of the Assumption of Moses, which has a real interesting story about how Michael and the devil fight over Moses' body. And, so there are other indications where there is other biblical material that's mentioned. And Paul quoted Greek poets in Acts 17 and Titus 1. And that doesn't suggest that these poets are now elevated to a status of inspired prophets. So I think that doesn't add weight to it. It says to me that it's a guy in 70 to 80 AD who knows normal literature out there, like the Dead Sea Scrolls, like other pieces of doctrine, like other pieces of knowledge that's out there. A man that's educated in the text of the day. and Jews and Christians alike would have recognized it as ancient literature. So I don't think it gives up any thoughts of the authorship of the book. I think it sounds like a person who was writing in that particular time period. Some people then also say that, it has some advanced doctrinal development in it, so it must have been later. And when you read it, it doesn't sound any different than what you would find in any of the other letters. So just because the doctrine was advanced doesn't mean that it was written later. It sounds to me exactly like all the other letters that we've been reading about. And then the last part of it is they were saying, well, there were people who wrote these anonymous texts and then pretended that they were part of the apostles' teaching. Think about, there's the Gospel of Thomas, which is clearly written in the 3rd century AD. But again, why would you pick Jude to be your fake author? It just doesn't make any sense. To me, this sounds like a guy writing in the same era as the other letters. There's no reason for me to believe that it's anyone but Jude. But then the second question comes in. Why was he writing this letter? What exactly was going on? And you can tell, he mentions it, that this was not the letter he intended to write. He intended to write this piece about their shared community belief in salvation. But instead, something urgent comes up. And in verse 3, he says that he had to write to contend for their faith that they once and for all entrusted to the saints. And contend means, to fight for. He's fighting for them. Something happened that changed the shape and the tone of the letters before he finished the first draft. And what happens, he describes in verse 4, is that certain people have crept into the community and infiltrated it. They started showing up and saying things that nobody believed. These teachings were perverting grace into a license to sin. Hey, we are already saved by grace. We can do whatever we want. We heard a little bit of that in the letters of Peter too. But also they were denying Christ as Master and Lord. And if you look at this type of false teaching that Jude is responding to, it's not really like a doctrinal dispute, like I think A and you think B and we're going to hash it out. Instead, it's a complete ethical collapse dressed up in theological language. These people are taking true doctrine of grace and the idea that we're saved not by our own efforts, and then twisting it into a permission to live like they wanted to live. If grace covered everything, then nothing really matters. We can do whatever we darn well want. Just enjoy yourself. And it's a perversion of what is happening. And we see this today. We see people pretending to be pastors, pretending to be scholars in the Bible and saying, oh, you know what? It never really meant that. Let me tell you what it meant. I can tell you the deep, dark secret of it. Jude is having none of it. He is making the case and doing so very practically. And he's not reaching for really abstract points. He points out 3 examples saying that this generation that came out of Egypt under Moses, rescued from slavery by God's own hand, but they were destroyed in the wilderness because of their unbelief. The angels who rebelled against God are now being held in chains awaiting their judgment. And Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed by fire for sexual immorality. These 3 illustrations hold the same pattern, that there is no privileged status. There's no rescuing yourself from rebellion. You're going to get judgment in that particular case. And the warning to his readers is obvious, that being part of God's covenant community does not make you exempt from the same consequences if you follow the same patterns of rebellion. Those groups rebelled. Don't follow after them. And so then he turns his language then to these infiltrators, calls them stains at the community shared meals. And then he gives these 14 words basically that he describes, that these are clouds carrying no rain, trees that bear no fruit, even in autumn, waves that crash and produce nothing but foam, and stars that have wandered out of their intended course or fixed patterns. These images are all the same. It looks like something that is a part that's going to do a thing, and then they don't do the thing. a cloud that has no rain, a tree that bears no fruit. All of them look okay, but they're not okay. And Jesus' deep concern is that these are bad people. They're counterfeits, that they are walking their way inside the community of faith and working against everything the community stands for. We see that today. And so anyway, the crisis behind this letter is not abstract heresy or even, like I said, a theological debate. These are people who are infiltrating the group and twisting the word of God. So Jude picks up his pen to, like I said, initially hopefully write them a warm letter, but then realize he has to write them with some urgency because of this issue. So before we close, I want to give you a few stylistic things that you can look at when you're looking at this. First of all, Jude likes to write in triplets. So those are 3-part phrases. And then he just stacks them together. He just seems to do that. He also has used those 14 words that are not used anywhere else in the New Testament. So you can tell he's not recycling phrases of Paul or Peter. He is using his own vivid letters and his own vivid writing style to grab the imagination of people with these natural images and trying to make an image in their heads that will last a long time, that they won't soon forget. And as someone who loves analogies, I think I'm going to get a big kick out of Jude. He's trying to paint a picture for all of us that will stick with us for a long, long time. And so now that we understand a bit more about Jude and some more information, we'll get a chance to see all of this in action. Like I said, this is something written somewhere in between 60 and 70 AD. Majority of scholars have always believed it was part of the New Testament and was always written by Jude, the brother of James. So like I said, we'll be starting the text itself. We'll go through it verse by verse, and I appreciate everyone who's watching this. You can email me at jill@startwithsmallsteps.com. This, like I said, is the Small Steps with God podcast or YouTube channel, but we will do the letter of Jude in the Bible in Small Steps podcast. This is on YouTube, and you can find everything I do at jillfromthenorthwoods.com. Appreciate you being out there.